The theme of tonight's RNC convention is Make America Strong once again, with a focus on the military and foreign policy. Joining us now, former assistant to President Trump for National Security Affairs, Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador, so good to see you. So tonight is all about foreign policy. What is the foreign policy of a second Donald Trump administration?
Well, no one really knows because Trump doesn't know. He doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't do policy in the commonly understood meaning of that phrase. He proceeds episodically, transactionally, and seen through the prism of what benefits Donald Trump. So he has themes that he comes back to, things he said over and over again, why he likes tariffs, why he likes to negotiate with authoritarian leaders, and why he basically doesn't want to get involved in American alliances, whether they strengthen American national security or not. Whether that comes through in either the vice presidential nominee's speech tonight or Trump's tomorrow, I don't know. But what you can predict with a high degree of certainty is that a Trump administration will proceed very uncertainly internationally.
There's been a lot of reporting. Andrea Mitchell's done a lot of great reporting about the hesitance that NATO allies have about a Donald Trump administration, a second term, the nervousness they have about it, whether they can rely on the United States. Donald Trump, of course, has not been so fond of NATO, and he's not said friendly things about NATO. But during his time in office, were his policies friendly toward NATO? I had the chairman of the Intel Committee, Congressman Turner, on today, who said that, yes, they were, and he believes NATO will be fine.
Well, I'd like to believe that
policies,
too.
By what you've seen before, I think really high confidence that he, again, will strengthen NATO, and certainly NATO's not at risk.
I'm sorry, that kind of came in out of nowhere, but what do you make of that?
Well, look, I respect the chairman's opinion a great deal, but he wasn't in the room with me in Brussels in 2018 at the NATO summit when Trump came within an inch of withdrawing from NATO. He doesn't understand the alliance. He sees it in terms of America providing defense contracting services to a bunch of ungrateful Europeans who don't pay for it. And if he had his druthers, I do think he would withdraw from the alliance. I think it's a very serious risk.
What about the subject of Ukraine and the pick of J.D. Vance? J.D. Vance is somebody who believes that Ukraine needs to make a peace deal with Russia and to cede territory if necessary. He doesn't believe it's good financially for the United States to keep sending money to Ukraine because he doesn't believe Ukraine has the ability to win. What's your expectation for a posture toward Ukraine with Donald Trump back in office and now with J.D. Vance as his running mate?
Well, I think it's going to be very bad for Ukraine. It's what Vance has said about it is wrong in many material respects. I don't think he appreciates the American national security interest in protecting Ukraine against this unprovoked Russian aggression. There seems to be this idea that we're doing this out of the goodness of our hearts. It's an act of charity. We're nice people, although we are. We're doing it because there's an American national security interest in peace and security in Europe. Huge trading partners of ours and allies in other areas around the world. It's interesting. One of the things Vance relies on is he says we just need the Europeans to do more in Europe because we have to worry more about Chinese threats in the Pacific. And it is the case that China is the existential threat this century, but it's forming an axis with Russia. These conflicts are connected. And maybe Vice President-designate Vance ought to listen to his boss's interview on Bloomberg News last night, where Trump said, Taiwan's 9,000 miles away from us. It's 100 miles away from China. It's really not worth the effort, basically, is what he said, which is consistent of what Trump has said about Taiwan on other occasions. I think there's a real disconnect here, but the bottom line is that these are candidates who do not fundamentally understand that a strong American presence in the world is good for us here at home.
So the new generation of MAGA Republicans don't believe in the old ways of the Republican Party, the hawkish foreign policy. They don't believe it worked. They believe it's led to disaster, and they'll point out what happened in the Middle East after 9/11. They'll say that George Bush and the policies of that administration were a failure and got us into an even bigger mess. That the United States can't be the world's policeman. And so when you come out and say they don't understand it, they will turn it back at you and say, well, you didn't understand it either, and you haven't put us in a safer place. What is the response to that sort of thinking that we hear so frequently among the new generation of Republicans here at the Republican convention?
Well, I don't think it's as widespread as perhaps some people think it is. I think the party remains very strongly committed to a Reaganite foreign policy. That's what polls show, including aid to Ukraine. I think it'd be extraordinarily foolish to walk away from NATO or to undercut NATO, the world's most successful political military alliance. I think in the Middle East, it was not the overthrow of the Taliban after 9/11 that caused the problem. It was the Trump deal that Biden implemented to withdraw from Afghanistan that's left us in real danger there. And I think the unwillingness of both Trump and the Democratic Party to pursue effective policies with respect to Iran. And when it comes to China, I don't think even the people like J.D. Vance appreciate that what Trump is most likely to do with China when it comes down to it, if only Xi Jinping calls him up after the election and congratulates him, to revert immediately to the negotiation mode to produce the biggest trade deal in history, which is what Trump really sees as an achievement. You know, this is an important conversation because I do think that the Republican Party is at risk of the virus of isolationism. We repeat this mistake from generation to generation, and I hope we're not about to repeat it again.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.